The chamber is open and full of whispers.
Before we dive in, check the link in the description if you want exclusive timelines, members-only videos you won't find on YouTube, all on our Patreon. Voldemort made 3 mistakes. The first was assuming James Potter's love of spectacle meant he valued safety less than strategy. He did not. The second was a nursery on Halloween night. He blasted through the front door of the cottage at Godric's Hollow, climbed the stairs, found an empty crib, and read the note on the wall. "You're looking in the wrong place." LP. He stood in the dark for a very long time. He destroyed the cottage anyway, purely on principle, then left. The third mistake, the one that ended him, he made 2 autumns later, at a gate in the Scottish Highlands, while a 5-year-old boy inside the property line was standing in his socks looking at the stars. Voldemort aimed his wand at a wall he could not see, and the wall answered in a language he had not expected. He did not know the child was there. He would never know. None of it happened the way the wizarding world believed it did. It started, instead, with a flat in Bethnal Green, and a man with shaking hands. Peter Pettigrew's hands shook when he poured. Not dramatically, not the trembling of someone performing distress for an audience. This was private shaking, the kind that builds across 3 months of interrupted sleep and 40-second intervals of checking the door because not checking it had stopped being possible. The flat in Bethnal Green had 4 chairs around a battered kitchen table, too many empty bottles, and a map of Britain on the wall that had run out of pins. The wizarding world was grinding through its 2nd year of a war that felt like it had been running since before any of them were born. Sirius noticed. He said nothing. He watched Peter the way Padfoot watched the edge of an unknown wood, not with suspicion, but with the focused attention of something built to track. James noticed too, and James was constitutionally less patient. He waited until Remus and Sirius had gone to bed. Gone to bed meaning behind a thin door in a room with 1 window, in a flat that was not large, and then he refilled Peter's glass with the fire whiskey Peter had stopped drinking an hour ago. "Tell me what they're offering you," James said. Peter went absolutely still. Then, with the relief of a man who has been carrying something alone for so long that even being caught feels like rest, he told him. "It came out badly organized, the way confessions come when they've been rehearsed in private too many times, and the rehearsal has stopped making sense to its owner. 8 weeks of approaches. The first, a man in a Hoxton pub who seemed to know Peter's route home, said nothing threatening, only implied. The second, less subtle than the first. The third, a photograph delivered by ordinary post, his mother's kitchen window from outside, the light on, her silhouette visible through the curtain. They said I was the clever one," Peter said. "The one nobody sees, that I was being wasted." James listened with his whole attention, which was a different thing from merely paying attention. He had always done this, given his complete organized focus when it mattered, the same focus he gave a transfiguration problem or a Quidditch formation. Peter had always found it both comforting and alarming to be seen this clearly. "They think you're a fall man," James said. "They're offering you a role, not safety. The moment you're used up, they'll blame you for everything. That's the plan. It's always the plan." He set down his glass. "I know what it feels like to believe you're not enough." The silence that followed required Peter to actually look up. James Potter was not supposed to say things like that. James Potter had never given any indication in 6 years of shared dormitory life that not enough was a category that applied to him. "I spent 6 years being exactly as good as Sirius in a fight, and exactly half as good at reading people," James said. "It took me a long time to understand that wasn't failure. It was just a different shape of useful." He leaned forward. "Your shape has kept all of us alive twice this year, Peter. You were in that room in Hogsmeade. You heard what they were planning. We moved 3 safe houses because of what you brought back." Peter looked at the table. His hands had stopped shaking. He noticed this. The shaking had stopped while he was talking, as though the weight of it had been the secrecy rather than the secret itself. James retrieved the grimoire from the study. It was not a dramatic object. His father had shown it to him on his 17th birthday with the matter-of-fact significance with which Charles Potter did everything, as though the world contained no hierarchy of importance, only things that needed doing. The cover was brown leather, the ink inside dense and occasionally water-damaged, and the handwriting shifted through generations in a way that told you more about the family than the words ever did. He opened it to the vow of the progenitor, read the relevant section aloud without performing it, just letting Peter hear the shape of it before anything was decided. "The ritual connects our cores, James said. Not permanently, not completely. But when you're genuinely afraid, the kind of afraid that shuts down thinking, you'll feel the edge of where my core is, like a sound you can follow back to a room. And if I still, it doesn't take your will. The grimoire is specific on that. What it does is make cowardice physically uncomfortable, because you'll feel the contrast, feel where courage exists, nearby, and the gap between where you are and where it sits. Over time, the gap narrows, not because the magic closes it, because you do. What if I'm not worth it? Peter said. Not quite a question. Ask me again in 10 years, James said. The ritual itself was small. James's signet ring, his grandfather's, worn down except where the metal was heaviest, had a sharp inner edge where the setting met the band. A small cut. Peter's hand turned palm up across the table. The clause was spoken first in Latin, the grimoire's formal language, then again in what the text called the caster's heart language, not the language they thought in, but the language they felt in, a distinction James had puzzled over at 17, and understood now. For James, that language was a sentence he had first said to Sirius at King's Cross at 11 years old, recognizing something in another person's face he had never found words for before, something approximately equivalent to you. And whatever this is, and however long it takes. For Peter, the word arrived quietly, the word he had used the day James Potter looked across a Hogwarts table and said, "Come sit with us," as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The word was always. The magic, when it took, had no visible effect. It felt, James said afterward, like a door in a familiar house that you had always assumed was a wall. Lily's preparations were extraordinary, and she would not have described them that way. She called them operational security. She built a decoy household at the cottage in Godric's Hollow using constructs she assembled in the manor's workroom over 4 consecutive nights, her notes covering the kitchen table in the same compressed, annotated handwriting that had covered her Hogwarts potions essays. The constructs registered as human to external detection. They moved through the house on irregular patterns. They ate, technically. The light usage mimicked real habitation rather than the telling regularity of automata. The Fidelius charm on Potter Manor was cast with Remus as secret keeper on a Thursday evening in October, in the back garden, with all 3 of them clear-eyed about what it meant. They had chosen Remus because Voldemort had never prioritized him, because his lycanthropy made his magical signature read as ambient interference to most detection equipment, and because he was, out of all of them, most capable of living with the weight of a secret that could never be shared. Remus accepted the role without ceremony. This was characteristic. On Halloween night, Lord Voldemort arrived at Godric's Hollow with the patience of something that had not needed to hurry in a very long time. He blasted the front door off its hinges. He walked through the entrance hall, the sitting room, the kitchen. He climbed the stairs. He found the nursery. He found the empty crib, the note on the wall. He left. He began searching. The search would take years, and patience in the wrong hands is simply a slower kind of danger. He found them 2 autumns later. Not the manor. The Fidelius held and would hold, and Voldemort could walk within 10 feet of the entrance gates and see nothing but empty highland hillside. What he found was the boundary of the ward structure itself, which Lily had keyed not to concealment, but to deterrence. You could not see what was inside, but you could feel that something enormous was there, if you were powerful enough to read the ambient resistance. Voldemort was powerful enough. He stood at the gate in the dark of an early winter night and pointed his wand at a wall he could not see. What happened next was 3 things converging in a way Lily had not anticipated. Because she had not anticipated that Voldemort would try to kill the ward itself, to drive a killing curse directly into the Fidelius architecture, and see if the structure would shatter. It was an unusual approach, technically creative, and it failed catastrophically. The Fidelius absorbed the curse and reflected it back with the force of everything it had been keyed to protect. The rebound tore through Voldemort's magical body with a violence that destroyed his physical form entirely, and would have ended him there, except that his soul had already been fragmented 6 times deliberately, and a fragmented soul is far harder to destroy than a whole one. What remained was barely a presence, cold, hardly coherent, a wraith wearing the memory of intention. But in the instant of the rebound, in the fractional second before the curse was fully absorbed and returned, something happened that Lily had not written into the ward schematics. A fragment of Voldemort's already shattered soul, small, wild, untethered, shot outward like a spark from a struck flint, and passed through the ward at the one point where the Fidelius operated on outward perception rather than inward protection. Harry James Potter was 5 years old. He was in the garden because he had woken from a dream and gone to look at the stars, which he did sometimes, because the star his parents had pointed out as his was currently visible, and he found it reassuring in the wordless way that 5-year-olds find things reassuring. He was standing at the kitchen door in his socks when the cold hit him. He woke James at 3 a.m. with his palm pressed to his forehead. "There was a man at the gate," he said. He was very cold, and then he wasn't there. The lightning bolt scar was already forming. James sat with his son until dawn. He did not explain immediately. Harry was 5, and the full explanation could wait for when it would mean something. But he held Harry's hand and felt, through the progenitor vow, the faint new presence at the edge of Harry's magic that had not been there the night before. Something small and wrong, like a note played in the wrong key in a familiar piece of music. Lily was in the workroom when James came to find her. She was already pulling the ward logs. "He tried to kill the ward," she said, without turning around. "Yes, and the rebound. Harry has a scar. And something else." Lily set down the log. She turned around. She looked at her husband with the expression she used when running a complete accounting of a situation before speaking, because speaking incorrectly in moments like this was something she did not do. "Tell me," she said. He told her. She listened the way she always listened to things that mattered, completely, without interruption. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "He's alive," she said. It was not a question, and not entirely a comfort. It was an inventory item. "He's alive," James confirmed. "And Voldemort is nothing we need to fear immediately, but he'll find a host eventually. Something to sustain him until he can rebuild." She looked at the ward logs. "We have time. Not as much as I'd like, but enough to prepare." Outside the workroom window, the Highland morning arrived gray and slow. The manor held its quiet. At the end of the East Wing corridor, Harry Potter slept with his palm against his new scar, and the Marauder map on the kitchen wall showed his footprint, small and still. And if you looked very carefully at the corner where the magic read strongest, a faint warmth in the ink around his name that had not been there the day before. Harry James Potter, at age 3, 2 years before the night at the gate, had already unlocked 2 doors wandlessly, summoned toys from across the sitting room on 4 separate occasions, and caused Peter Pettigrew's chair to lurch forward hard enough to break Peter's nose during an argument about the last treacle tart. The Marauders were in the kitchen after. The conversation was brief and not entirely comfortable. Sirius, he's extraordinary. Remus, he's a danger to himself and to Peter's nose. Peter holding a cloth to his face. He broke my nose. James, he's going to be the most powerful wizard alive. A pause. And he has no one to talk to. This settled over them differently than the other statements. Sirius stopped looking satisfied. Peter lowered the cloth. Harry was surrounded by 5 of the most capable magical minds of their generation, and not a single peer. A teacher was not a peer. A parent was not a peer. A peer was someone who looked at the same world from the same altitude and made you reach further not by demanding it, but simply by existing at a height that made reaching feel natural. "He needs a second," Lily said from the doorway, holding a monitoring chart she updated weekly from the detection network she ran in the manor's east-facing workroom. The network was the most sophisticated Muggle proximity magical detection system in existence. She described it to James as a hobby. No one in the household believed this. Not a follower, someone who would argue him into a wall and mean it. James looked at her. She was looking at the chart. "You found someone," he said. "I've been watching someone. 3 weeks. The signature is 4 years old. The architecture is..." She set the chart on the table. "Come and look at this." The readings were unlike anything in her database. Most children's early magic was chaotic, emotional in origin, directionally incoherent, the magical equivalent of shouting in a large room and being surprised by the echo. The signature she had been tracking in South London was something else. 4 events, each as precisely shaped as the last. A Tuesday, every light in a primary school classroom changed color simultaneously, each shifted by exactly the same degree. A Thursday, 6 library chairs arranged themselves into a configuration demonstrably more ergonomic than the one they'd been in. "The emotional trigger is still there," Lily said. "Still accidental. But the execution is tidy, Remus said, reading over her shoulder. Architecturally tidy, as if the mind housing this magic was already, at 4 years old, imposing order on the output. She tapped the chart. Her name is Hermione Jean Granger. Her parents are dentists in Camberwell. She has been reading independently since she was 3. She is currently working through a children's encyclopedia 3 years above her reading level. And she is, by every arithmetic measure I can construct, the most precisely calibrated magical prodigy I have detected in 11 years of running this network. Silence. James, how long do you want to watch before you go? Lily, I already have an appointment. The Granger's house in Camberwell had a blue front door and a window box of herbs that were doing better than most window box herbs because someone in the household was paying genuine attention to them. Lily arrived on a Tuesday morning in Muggle clothes, with a briefcase and the kind of expression that said, "I know this is unusual," without being apologetic about it. Dr. Helen Granger opened the door with the composure of someone who had spent years in a professional environment where people regularly said things that were incorrect and had developed a precise, non-judgmental method for receiving new information before assessing it. Dr. Robert Granger appeared behind her, taller, quieter, with the bearing of a man who trusted his own process and had produced through that process a daughter currently visible at the end of the hallway, reading a book larger than her torso, with total, undivided absorption. Hermione looked up when Lily walked in. She assessed Lily with the rapid accuracy of a child who has learned, through a particular kind of loneliness, to evaluate adults quickly and correctly. Then she went back to her book. Not all the way back. She was listening. The presentation took 90 minutes. Lily had prepared materials, not to perform but because she believed anyone making an important decision deserved accurate information, organized in a way that made the decision possible. Historical data on magical emergence in Muggle-born children. 3 papers from the Journal of Advanced Magical Theory. She also answered, "I don't know." That's genuinely still debated, to one of Helen's questions without any apparent distress about admitting it, which shifted something in Helen's assessment considerably. Robert asked about danger. Lily told him the truth. The wizarding world was politically fractured. Recently traumatized by a war it was still in the early stages of pretending to have recovered from, and his daughter would attract prejudice he would find both incomprehensible and infuriating as she grew into her abilities. She would also be trained, protected, and surrounded by people who had spent years building infrastructure to make that danger navigable. "This isn't adoption," Lily said. "It's extension. Hermione doesn't lose you. You gain access to the world she's going to inhabit whether we planned for it or not." "And if we say no?" Robert asked. "Then she gets a letter at 11 from an owl she's never seen, and she goes to school knowing nothing. And she figures it out anyway, because she will. She's that exceptional, but she'll do it alone, and the first year will be harder than it needs to be." Helen looked at her husband. He looked back. This was how they made decisions. Not in words, but in the quality of attention they gave each other, the shorthand of people who had done this long enough to share it. At the end of the hallway, Hermione closed her book on her thumb to keep her page. "The woman says I have magic," she said. Not to anyone in particular. A statement requiring confirmation. "Yes," Lily said. Hermione considered this for 2 seconds. "I thought so." She opened her book again. Helen looked at her daughter with the accumulated expression of 4 years of watching a child sort books by color, then size, then publication date, then some internal logic no one else could follow. A child who asked questions teachers couldn't answer, and wasn't embarrassed to say so. A child who had been lonely in the way of people who see patterns no one around them is seeing. "What's the manor like?" Helen asked. "Cold in the mornings until you learn where the warm rooms are," Lily said. "Large enough that children can be loud without it mattering. The library has 3,000 volumes. Several are restricted, but not in ways that will affect a 4-year-old for some years yet." From the hallway, "Did you say library?" Harry, age 3, met Hermione, age 4, in the kitchen. She was taller than him. He examined this with the frank assessment of a child who had not yet learned to pretend not to notice things. "You're Harry Potter," Hermione said. "Yes. Your magic is louder than mine." Harry considered this with the seriousness the observation deserved. "Yours is tidier." Hermione thought about it. "That seems about right." They went to look at the fish tank in the sitting room, which Harry had been wanting to show someone since Tuesday. Hermione examined it with her nose approximately 4 inches from the glass. Peter Pettigrew, watching from the kitchen doorway with his tea, said quietly to no one in particular, "Well, that's it then." It was. Completely, immediately, and for the rest of their lives, it was. James Potter did not start with wands. He started with a stone. Ordinary granite from the manor grounds, gray, slightly flat on one side, the kind that had been a stone for a long time and had developed opinions about staying that way. He set it on the practice room floor in front of 4-year-old Harry, crouched to his level, and said, "This stone wants to be something else. Your job is to find out what." Harry spent 3 days with it. He carried it to breakfast. He brought it to bed. On the morning of the 3rd day, he was cross-legged on the practice room floor with his eyes closed, and his face arranged in the expression of someone who has stopped trying and started listening. And the stone turned briefly into a copper coin, and he dropped it immediately because it was hot. "Why was it hot?" James asked. Harry examined his palm. "Because it wanted to be a coin from a place where coins are made in fire." James walked to the practice room door, stood in the corridor for 30 seconds being quietly devastated at how precisely correct this was, and went back in. "Good. Now find out what it wants to be when it isn't a coin." Hermione's first transfiguration happened 6 weeks later. She had spent those weeks reading 3 books on crystalline structures, their formation conditions, which mineral compositions produced which results under which pressures. She had a notebook open beside the stone when she finally attempted it, because undocumented results were anecdotes, and she had no use for anecdotes. The stone became a pyrite cube, correct in every dimension. On the first attempt, she was 4 years old. James told Sirius that evening. Sirius poured himself a significantly larger whiskey than the conversation required, drank half of it, and said, "Both of them. Both of them," James said. Sirius looked at the ceiling for a moment. "We need a better curriculum." James's mornings became combat transfiguration and flight. Formation flying began at 5, not racing, not Quidditch, but the ability to maintain position relative to a moving partner through fog, crosswind, and speed changes that gave no warning. By 7, Harry could navigate blind using Hermione's verbal coordinates at competition pace. Hermione could read a wind pattern and predict the broom's response before it happened. By 9, they had developed 47 distinct body signals for use in the air at speeds that made speech impractical, and they never needed to explain any of them to each other. The partial animagus approach was James's invention, something he had developed over years of solitary theoretical work, with no precedent in any published transfiguration text. Standard animagus transformation was binary, full form or no form. James had identified, through a combination of the family grimoire and a decade of private research, that the transformation could be held at deliberate ratios if the caster had sufficient control and a pre-existing animagus form to draw from, a technique that had never existed before him, built for the specific purpose of teaching a child to be extraordinary without losing the things that made him human. At 9, under James's direct guidance, and after 2 years of careful groundwork, Harry achieved his first controlled partial transformation, the stag at 30%, providing leg strength without sacrificing his wand hand. The first time it held properly, he ran the length of the practice room in under a second and hit the far wall hard enough to crack the plaster. He sat on the floor, slightly stunned. "How did that feel?" James asked. Harry thought about it. "Like being myself, but also right." James looked at him. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly it." Sirius taught in environments. He did not explain. He built situations and let them do the teaching, faster and considerably more alarming than lectures. Combat hide-and-seek, the children's name, began when Harry was 6. Sirius apparated them under side-along to a different location each session, a covered market, a railway platform, the edge of a Muggle festival in the rain. The rules were simple. Sirius was hunting them. 30 minutes. Reach the extraction point without being found. He hunted them seriously. Padfoot's tracking instinct, combined with the full Black family detection repertoire, made him approximately the most difficult opponent they could have been given. For the first 6 months, he found them in an average of 4 minutes. By Harry's 8th birthday, the individual records were 23 minutes for Harry and 29 for Hermione. The first time they ran together as a unit rather than 2 separate individuals, they made the full 30 and were eating chips near the extraction point when Sirius arrived. He sat down beside them, checked his watch, and said, "Right, we need new rules." The shadow walk technique came at 7. Not apparition, it did not trigger anti-apparition jinxes, left no magical trace, and operated by shifting the caster into a state of semi-presence, between rather than invisible, for up to 30 meters. It required absolute stillness of intent, hardest for Harry, easiest for Hermione, and absolute physical commitment to the motion, which was the inverse. The day Hermione completed her first unassisted shadow walk, she was 9 and had spent 3 months on the physical execution after mastering the theory in 2 weeks. She crossed the practice room, passed through the shadow of the doorway, and arrived on the other side looking exactly as she'd left, except for the expression of someone who has just confirmed a calculation she was fairly certain would work. Sirius Black sat down slowly on the floor. He stayed there for a while. He would deny, later, that his eyes had done anything notable. No one believed him. "You're the focal point," he told Hermione, once they had progressed far enough for tactical explanation. "Let them track you specifically. While they watch you, he's doing the thing they're not supposed to see." Hermione considered this. "I find that framing mildly reductive. You're the intellectual engine, and he's the operationally decisive instrument." Better. Remus taught taxonomy before spells. His defense curriculum began not with counters, but with mechanism. What dark magic was, how it operated, what it extracted from a living being. Dark magic was not classified as dark because someone had decided it was unpleasant. It was dark because its underlying architecture required taking something from the living. Pain, life force, the weight a soul carries. Understanding the mechanism produced counters that rote learning never could. By 8, Harry had a working nonverbal Patronus. A stag, young and light-antlered, leaving frost patterns on the floor that persisted for several minutes. Remus noted in his teaching journal that over the following years, the stag visibly aged, which was the only Patronus he had ever seen do so, as if the form were keyed not to a fixed memory, but to an ongoing one. Hermione's Patronus refused to commit to a shape for 14 months. It manifested as silver mist, intensely defensive, apparently purposeful, but formless. Remus told her not to force it. She understood, and forced it for 6 weeks, and nothing happened. Then she stopped. And on a Tuesday afternoon in February, in the middle of an argument with Peter about the theoretical limits of animagus detection range, a fully formed silver otter erupted from her wand with enough force to knock 2 chairs sideways. Remus looked at the otter for a long time. He would spend weeks thinking about what it meant about her, and arrive at an answer that seemed, when he found it, entirely obvious. An otter was a creature of both worlds, equally at home in water and on land, relentless in its efficiency, and, in the way of all things that look playful, considerably more formidable than it appeared. Peter taught what the others couldn't. He had a face that forgot itself, cultivated across a lifetime into the most useful thing a person could look like, someone already processed and moved on from. His espionage curriculum began with a principle the children found counterintuitive. The most dangerous person in any room is the one nobody's tracking. He taught them to read rooms before entering, to identify rhythms and exceptions, to locate the spots where attention lapsed and the moments when routines slipped. He taught the ratio principle for Harry's partial animagus work, that the degree of transformation should match the tactical need, never default to maximum, because control was always worth more than power. He taught them, quietly, across 3 years, to distinguish between a person performing confidence and a person who had it. The performance had a detectable frequency, something in how often the eyes checked the exit, something in how carefully the hands were kept still. Peter had spent 30 years watching people perform confidence from rooms where no one thought he was paying attention. He was always paying attention. That had always been the whole point. At the end of year 7 of the children's training, James set an assessment. He told them, infiltrate the study, retrieve the watch from the left desk drawer, return to their rooms without triggering any of the 17 detection layers he had built into the room. He told the Marauders that the children would not succeed, because the detection architecture on the study was the most sophisticated he had ever constructed. And because overconfidence in students was a pedagogical problem, he preferred to correct early. All 4 of them sat on the upstairs landing with butterbeer and watched the study door. 14 minutes later, Harry and Hermione were in their rooms. James's grandfather's watch, small silver engraved on the case, was on Hermione's desk. Beside it was a note in her handwriting. The south side ward has an edge gap at 25 degrees. Suggest recalibrating to 30. H.G. James stared at the note for a long time. Then he went downstairs and sat next to Lily at the kitchen table and said nothing. "They're ready," Lily said, without looking up from her work. "I know," James said. "I'm not sure I am." Lily set down her quill. She looked at him with the expression she used when she had decided the obvious thing and the true thing were the same. "You've been ready since the stone," she said. "You just needed them to prove it." Platform 9 3/4, on the 1st of September, carried the weight of an occasion that understood its own significance. Steam from the Scarlet engine drifted across the platform in long horizontal sheets. Families moved through it with the choreography of people who had done this before. Trunks and owls, and the emotional register of a goodbye that is also a beginning. Every wizarding family of consequence was here. This was the year of the post-war generation's children, the first cohort born entirely into peace, whose parents were survivors and who had grown up with Voldemort as a name in history books, rather than a sound that made adults go quiet. Harry Potter was 11 years old. He had his father's jaw, his mother's eyes, a lightning bolt scar on his forehead that had gone silver-white over the years, and the bearing of someone for whom the next thing was always already in motion. He moved through the platform with Hermione at his left shoulder, and their trunks charmed to follow, and if either of them experienced anything that could be called nerves, it was not visible to anyone paying attention. Hermione was 12, born in the last days of September, 1 year older in a year she had agreed to defer from Hogwarts, contingent on access to the restricted Marauder collection and a structured independent research module that Remus had designed and she had completed 6 weeks ahead of schedule. She carried herself with the composure of someone who has read every Hogwarts textbook through year 5, and is managing the awareness that this is not technically a normal amount of preparation. They boarded the train, found a compartment. Ron Weasley appeared in the doorway 40 minutes out of London, asking if there was room, and sat down with the flushed manner of someone who had been rehearsing that entrance for 2 carriages, and was relieved it had worked. Harry told him about 3 times Peter had used a railway platform as a training ground. Ron's expression shifted from polite interest to something genuinely engaged, which was the beginning of most of his important friendships. McGonagall came to meet the boats at Hogsmeade as tradition required. What tradition had never required, and what had accordingly not occurred in the recorded history of the school, was for 5 adult witches and wizards to cross the lake in a conjured craft that Sirius produced from thin air with the ease of a man who could not do anything without making it look inevitable. McGonagall watched them approach. She had taught all 4 Marauders. She had given James and Sirius detentions she privately felt they had earned, watched Remus become someone she respected deeply and quietly, revised her assessment of Peter more times than she could count. She had also attended the memorial service for James and Lily in the grim autumn after Voldemort's defeat, a service held with enormous public feeling for people who were not, as it turned out, dead. She tightened her lips considerably. "James," she said when he stepped ashore. "Minnie," James said, "you cannot accompany first-year students into the castle." "We're not accompanying first-year students," Sirius said, stepping off behind him with a folder already produced from his jacket. "We're accompanying our children. The ancient houses of Black and Potter hold historical escort privileges at the sorting of their heirs, documented in the Hogwarts Charter from the 17th century, under the provision covering heir presentation rights." McGonagall read the documentation with the thoroughness she brought to everything. She passed it to Dumbledore, who had appeared in the castle doorway with his hands folded and an expression containing several things simultaneously. Dumbledore read. He looked at the Marauders. He looked at the first years milling at the entrance, among whom Harry and Hermione were visible, standing slightly apart from the others with the ease of people who have arrived at a scheduled appointment rather than an unfamiliar destination. "The provision is accurate," he said. "Welcome to Hogwarts." The great hall on sorting night had the quality it always had. The candles, the enchanted ceiling showing the first cold stars of early autumn, 4 long tables and several hundred students with 10 weeks of information to transmit simultaneously. The noise dropped when the first years filed in, the older students turning to assess the incoming class with the attention of people evaluating something that would affect them for 7 years. The sorting hat sang. McGonagall unrolled her scroll. Names were called. Children approached the stool. Ron Weasley was sorted into Gryffindor 4 names before Harry, arriving at the table with the flushed relief of someone who had been genuinely uncertain and was grateful to be wrong in the right direction. Then Granger, Hermione, A girl with dark hair that had been formally introduced to a plate and had largely escaped it walked to the stool and placed the sorting hat on her own head, with the manner of someone following a procedure she had researched and understood. The hat went still. Then it began talking to her. Not the usual internal deliberation, an actual conversation, visible in the way Hermione's expression kept shifting, receiving new information and evaluating it. At one point she appeared to correct something. The Hall exchanged glances. What the Hall could not know was this: the sorting hat contained the imprints of all 4 founders, and Salazar Slytherin's voice had been waiting, for centuries. It seemed, for a student who would address it not as an authority to obey, but as an intelligence to engage with. Hermione had done this within 30 seconds of the hat settling on her head. Slytherin's ancient imprint was, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely delighted by someone it was meeting. Hence the conversation. Hence, also, the brevity of what followed. The hat said, with the audible quality of being slightly startled, "Gryffindor." Hermione walked to the Gryffindor table, took a seat, removed her notebook from her robe pocket, and opened it to a fresh page. The older students nearest her watched this with expressions ranging from bemusement to something approaching respect. "Potter, Harry," the Hall changed. Not uniformly, in the way recognition moves through a large space table by table as a name assigned to a legend encountered a real person attached to it. Harry Potter was supposed to be dead. He had died with his parents at Godric's Hollow, in the story the wizarding world had been telling itself for 10 years. And he was not supposed to be standing at the front of the Great Hall with James Potter's jaw and Lily Potter's eyes, and the particular settled calm of someone who has never once been confused about who he is. The hat touched his head. 11 seconds later, because Harry had spoken first, in the old Slytherin diplomatic register, and because Salazar's voice had found what it had been searching 1,000 sorting nights for, the hat declared, "Gryffindor." The Gryffindor table erupted. Harry sat beside Hermione, who gave him a small nod of someone confirming an arrangement. "That went well," Harry said. "Define well," Hermione said, without looking up from her notebook. Nobody fainted. The Hufflepuff table looked close. Close doesn't count. At the high table, Dumbledore rose slowly. He found James Potter's eyes in the gallery where the 5 adults had positioned themselves, with their sightlines confirmed in advance. James did not look hostile or triumphant. He looked like a man who had made a plan a decade ago and was watching it arrive on schedule, privately, fiercely glad. Dumbledore said very quietly into the noise, "How long?" The question found Lily across the candlelit space. She held his gaze with the expression of a woman who had prepared for this conversation for 11 years. "Long enough," she said. At the Slytherin table, Draco Malfoy was watching Harry with an expression working hard at contempt and arriving somewhere more complicated. Harry felt it, looked across the hall, and met Draco's eyes without offering anything back, simply receiving the attention the way Sirius had taught him, as if Draco were a room Harry was noting the layout of before deciding whether to enter. Draco looked away first. He would spend considerable time in the following days trying to understand what had happened in that exchange, and would not reach a satisfying conclusion. Beside Draco, Theodore Nott ate in silence and watched Harry and Hermione with neither threat nor simple admiration, just the expression of someone running a long calculation and finding the answer more interesting than expected. He said nothing. He filed it away. It would matter sooner than he anticipated. Hermione found the Philosopher's Stone through the ward map. Not the object itself, the shape of its absence. The negative space left by protections too dense and deliberate for anything the standard castle architecture required. She had been building the map since the 2nd week of term using the index's detection layer, an intelligence system she had begun constructing at 10, which Harry had contributed the threat response architecture to at 11, reading the castle's magical structure the way a geologist reads strata, by what was there, what was thicker than it should be, and what that thickness implied. The 3rd-floor corridor registered as wrong in mid-October. She brought the map to Harry that evening in the Gryffindor common room and indicated the relevant section with her pen without speaking. Harry looked at the detection readings, the density notation, the layering estimates. "That's not storage," he said. 7 protection layers by my count, possibly 8. The outermost 2 are obscuring the inner architecture. She turned the map over. On the back, organized columns, each layer, its probable origin, her confidence level. "The Devil's Snare is Sprout's work. The signature matches her herbology classroom protections. The key enchantment is Flitwick. The chest construction is too sophisticated for anyone on staff except McGonagall. Harry read down the list and stopped at the final entry. Quirrell, he said. Structurally anomalous. By every measure, his magical ability shouldn't match the others in this sequence. The only consistent model is that he isn't designing from his own abilities. Someone else is directing him, and placed their work at the final gate of a sequence they intend to penetrate, which means they can penetrate it. The cold readings around him, Harry said. Logged since the second week of term. Consistent with a parasitic presence. Something attached to him rather than native to him. Weakened Wraith State dark magic, if you use the taxonomy from Remus's Year 4 theoretical literature. Something that lost its physical body through catastrophic magical backlash and requires a host to maintain coherence. Harry was quiet for a moment. Someone who needed a host because they lost their body trying to breach a ward. Someone who has been searching for a path back ever since, Hermione said. They requested a formal meeting with Dumbledore using the student representation provisions of the Hogwarts Charter, not as children asking for an audience, but as House Potter representatives requesting consultation on a matter of school security. The distinction mattered for the record. Dumbledore granted it within 3 days. They arrived with a 12-page report, 2 appendices, and the ward map. Fawkes regarded them from his perch. The portraits of previous headmasters, some asleep, some not, watched with the particular attention of people who had seen a great many things and were presently seeing something unusual. Dumbledore read the report with the thoroughness of someone who reads everything that way, without visible impatience, without skipping. When he set it down, "You are correct on all 17 points." They had agreed in advance to let this sit. "How did you identify the threat actor?" Dumbledore asked. "The final layer's magical signature is inconsistent with Professor Quirrell's documented capability," Hermione said. "A signature that's sophisticated, placed by someone with demonstrably inadequate independent ability, requires an external source of magical direction. The cold ambient readings around him are consistent with a weakened dark presence, using him as a vessel, building toward restoration through the stone. Peter taught us that the person who controls the last door is the person who intends to use it," Harry said. "We also know what kind of entity would be in that condition. We know what your wards defeated 2 autumns before I came to Hogwarts." The room was very quiet. "Your recommended response," Dumbledore said, turning to the report, "includes integration of the index's secondary alert layer into the school's ward architecture. Specifications are in Appendix A, pages 9 through 11, Hermione said. It would provide real-time notification of any unauthorized approach to the protection sequence. The stone was moved that night. Quirrell was placed under formal observation. By winter, he had become visibly ill, deteriorating in the way of a host whose body cannot sustain what occupies it. He resigned at Christmas, citing nervous exhaustion, and was found in Albania 3 months later by Aurors, acting on intelligence James passed through a back channel, maintained since the underground years. Found, treated, and found to be Quirrell again, the parasitic presence having departed when the host became insufficient to sustain it. Voldemort denied the stone and without an adequate body retreated further into whatever shadow state sustained him. The timetable shifted, the direction did not. A formal letter arrived 3 days later bearing Dumbledore's seal. A commendation for services to school security entered into the official records, with a request that the index's alert layer be permanently integrated into Hogwarts ward architecture. The student developers acknowledged as co-architects in the school's documentation. Hermione read it twice. She purchased a frame in Hogsmeade. She had anticipated a written response of some kind and prepared for it, and placed the letter inside. Harry looked at the frame. "That's a bit much. It's the first formal external acknowledgement of the index's capability from an institutional authority. Archiving important documents is methodology, not vanity." Peter's reply to Harry's letter arrived by return owl. 4 words. "I told you so." Below that, in smaller writing, as though added after the initial response was sealed and then reopened, "Well done, both of you. Tell her the framing was the right call." Harry set the note on Hermione's desk where she would find it in the morning. She was already asleep over a book, which happened sometimes when she had been awake since before dawn, and her body made the decision her mind wouldn't. Outside the castle, the first proper snow of term came down over the grounds, and the castle held its warmth against it the way old things do, completely, without effort. Their second year at Hogwarts arrived with Gilderoy Lockhart's self-portrait already installed in the defense classroom. Approximately twice the size professional self-assessment would suggest was appropriate, depicting its subject in three-quarter profile with his wand raised at something painted out of frame, presumably because whatever it was would have required research to render accurately. The portrait winked at students as they entered. It adjusted its expression based on who was looking at it. Harry looked at it for 4 seconds, then looked at Hermione, who had already opened her notebook to a page that was not blank. She had started the documentation over summer. The file on Gilderoy Lockhart had begun as a theoretical exercise. Lily's suggestion that they use the appointment as a case study in identifying and responding to institutional incompetence. It had become, over 6 weeks, something considerably more useful. Hermione had written to 3 witches whose exploits appeared in Lockhart's books, using forwarding addresses obtained through the Journal of Advanced Magical Theories contributor network. One had responded, a witch in Macedonia named Varvara, whose reply included a signed and notarized statement describing the afternoon Lockhart had appeared at her door, praised her work extensively, and then performed a memory charm that she had partially shielded against because she happened to be wearing a runic suppressor for an unrelated purpose. The suppressor had deflected roughly 40% of the charm's force. Varvara's statement was 6 pages with dates. Her handwriting was very small and very precise, and her tone was that of a woman who had been waiting for someone to ask. James located 2 additional subjects through his own channels, people from the Order years who had encountered Lockhart professionally and had similar accounts. Similarly documented, Peter filed the paperwork. The completed file was 17 pages, typeset, with 2 appendices. The covering letter referenced a Hogwarts charter provision that allowed the head of an ancient and noble house to contest a faculty appointment within the first 10 days of term on documented grounds of credential fraud, dormant for well over a century, not because it had been repealed, but because no one had thought to use it. What Hermione had discovered when she obtained Lockhart's academic record through the Ministry's Educational Records Office, filed 6 weeks before term, was that his defense OWL sat at acceptable and his NEWT had never been completed. Insufficient to establish the expertise his books had claimed across 2 decades. The board conflict of interest issue was cleaner. Dumbledore had identified Lockhart as a candidate, and Lucius Malfoy as a board governor had formally sponsored and approved the appointment, placing his name on the authorization documentation as the appointment's institutional advocate. The board's own charter prohibited members from formally sponsoring faculty appointments and subjects their children would be taught. Draco Malfoy was enrolled in defense as a second-year student. The prohibition was explicit. Malfoy had either ignored it or not read his own charter carefully enough, and Peter had bet correctly on the second explanation. On the second day of term, Lockhart swept into the defense classroom and distributed a quiz. The questions included his favorite color and how many times he had been awarded Witch Weekly's Most Charming Smile Award. He confirmed the answers to the latter with visible pleasure. He was 3 minutes into his introductory lecture when the classroom door opened. Harry set a scroll on Lockhart's desk. I'm filing a challenge of appointment under the Hogwarts Charter. This is a certificate of representation from the House of Potter authorizing me to act in formal proceedings. He placed the folder beside it. We've prepared a summary. Lockhart's smile encountered something it didn't know how to process. Now, I appreciate the enthusiasm. The grounds are in the summary, Harry said pleasantly. Take your time. Lockhart opened the folder, read the first page, turned to the second. His smile did not disappear. It was too structural for that. But it developed, around the edges, the quality of something that has lost its internal architecture. He found the 3 sworn statements, including Varvara's 6-page account with its dates and its precise description of the charm's mechanism. He found the page showing his own academic record. He reached the board conflict of interest section, with its reference to the charter prohibition and Draco Malfoy's enrollment. The classroom watched in the concentrated silence of people witnessing something they would be describing to others for years. Draco Malfoy, 3 rows back, had gone completely still. The Board of Governors has already received a copy, Hermione said, as has the Ministry Education Committee. The Daily Prophet holds an embargoed copy that will publish at the end of the week if the appointment is not formally withdrawn before then. The appointment was withdrawn on Wednesday. Lockhart departed Hogsmeade Thursday morning. His self-portrait was taken down Thursday afternoon. By Friday, the corridor smelled normal again, and most of the castle had processed his presence as an event that had resolved before it could establish itself. This was, given everything, the most fitting outcome for a man whose primary magical skill was erasing memories. Lucius Malfoy arrived on Thursday with the bearing of a man who had been resolving problems of this category for 20 years, and found the work straightforward. He found James and Sirius in the entrance hall. "The challenge stands," James said. "The board met this morning without you, which was permissible, given that your sponsorship of the appointment is itself the subject of a conflict filing. The appointment has been withdrawn. You have no authority to. Lord Potter and Lord Black collectively hold 7 board votes through direct seat and proxy," Sirius said. "That's been true since August. The solicitor filed the proxy documentation in July, through channels that don't require our physical presence anywhere near ministry records. We've had a majority of the active board membership since summer." "Furthermore," James said, with the tone of a man who has been waiting years for a specific sentence, "Sirius has filed a formal request with the Wizengamot to review your claim of acting under the Imperious Curse during the First Wizarding War. The filing cites 6 documented instances of you acting with full situational judgment inconsistent with Imperious compliance. Peter did the filing." Lucius went very still. "You'll want to speak to your solicitor," James said. "Before the Wizengamot session, the filing is public record as of this morning." Lucius left, walked back through the entrance hall and out the castle doors, with a posture doing the work of composure without fully achieving it, the posture of a man who has just discovered that the room he thought he controlled has been operating under different rules for longer than he knew. Theodore Knott, watching from the first-floor corridor above, filed everything he had observed into a mental folder he had been building since the sorting. The folder was getting very interesting. He did not tell Draco, who was still processing last week, and would not have heard him anyway. In the same autumn, Lily felt the diary the moment it crossed the school's ward boundary. She was at the Manor's workroom desk when the detection network pulsed with the cold, precise frequency she had spent 11 years learning to read. Not the ring. Dumbledore had found and destroyed that Horcrux during the long underground years, aided by intelligence James had passed to him through back-channel correspondence. Not the locket, currently hidden in a sea cave on the coast. Something else, an object she had been tracking at a distance for years, tied to the Malfoy family's magical signature, which had stayed put until now. She wrote 2 sentences. "The letter reached Hogwarts by morning. The object I flagged from the Malfoy collection has entered the school. Do not engage with it directly. I will explain at the weekend." Hermione's reply came by return owl. 3 pages, identifying the carrier. Ginny Weasley had been losing weight since the first week of term. Hermione had noticed it in the way she noticed patterns, not in a single observation, but in the accumulation of small consistent ones. Presence becoming partial, then partially less. She wrote in a diary at odd hours, with the absorbed intensity of someone who had found something that felt important. Remus flagged the same behavioral pattern in his defense assessment notes, and sent word to James the following Friday. James retrieved the diary on a Saturday morning during breakfast, when the Gryffindor common room was empty. He found Ginny's bag beside her usual chair, removed the object, and replaced it with a blank journal Lily had prepared, warmed with a familiar weight charm so it would sit correctly, the cover texture matched. The process took 4 minutes. Ginny came back from the Great Hall and noticed nothing. Within a week, her color was better. Within 2, she was eating properly. She would not know what had been in her bag or what it had been doing to her for some time. And this was the correct decision. The diary's unmaking took 3 months of prior work and 47 seconds of execution. Snape had been working on a theoretical substrate approach for 2 years, since an evening following Harry's first individual potions session, when a student's question about counteragent theory had given him the framing he had been missing for a problem he had been circling for years. He brought his findings to Lily in early autumn of the second year, with the total focus he reserved for things that genuinely interested him, completely, without social management, trusting that the recipient could assess the work on its own terms. Lily read his notes in one sitting. The substrate heating sequence has a gap in the rune activation chain. Between the 3rd and 4th activation points, the transition is too abrupt. The soul fragment can destabilize before the anchor dissolves, which produces containment failure. "I know," Snape said. "I haven't solved it." "Hermione might have," Lily said. She sent Hermione the theoretical problem that evening, framed as a research exercise rather than a crisis, because Hermione worked better when a problem was presented as interesting, and because Hermione was 12 and deserved a genuine problem rather than a simplified version of one. 3 weeks later, Hermione sent back 12 pages. The rune activation sequence was on pages 9 and 10. It solved the transition gap through an intermediate activation point derived from a runic variant she had found in a pre-ministry text in the Potter Restricted Collection. Cross-referenced with Snape's substrate theory and 2 arithmetic projection models she had run independently. Snape read it twice. He wrote to Lily, "The sequence is correct. She found in 3 weeks what I could not find in a year. She is 12 years old." Lily wrote back, "I know. Are you going to tell her? Or shall I?" He told her himself. He returned her practical assessment with outstanding marked at the top and a single annotation at the bottom. "Submit this to the journal when you are older. Do it before you leave school." Hermione read the annotation 4 times. She added it to the notebook she kept of things she intended to remember, and told Harry about it. And Harry told Peter. And Peter's reply arrived at breakfast on a Wednesday and was folded very carefully and put in her pocket. The diary was unmade at Potter Manor in December, using Snape's substrate compound, Hermione's rune sequence, and Lily's execution. 47 seconds. The soul fragment ceased without drama, the cessation of something held in place against its nature, and finally released from the holding. The diary afterward was leather and paper, old, slightly warped, and entirely empty. The encounter between Lily and Snape happened by accident in autumn, the way the most important conversations happen, not when anyone was prepared for them. Snape was in his classroom on a Tuesday morning reviewing supply requisitions, the room empty, the long stone benches clear of cauldrons. Lily walked in looking for Hermione's misplaced potions notes and had crossed half the room before she registered that the figure at the front desk was not the empty room she had anticipated. He had gone completely still, not the stillness of someone choosing not to move, but the freeze of a man whose nervous system has encountered something filed as impossible and has not yet transmitted the correction. He looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then, in a voice that came out wrong for sound rather than for emotion, the way a word comes out when it has been held for a decade and doesn't know how to be released. "Lily." She stopped. "Severus." She did not perform the conversation. What had always worked with Snape was simply being in the room with him honestly, and waiting for the room to do what rooms do between people who have known each other long enough. She sat in the nearest student chair. He stood at the front with the supply requisitions still in his hand, not appearing to notice them, and looked at her with an expression that was not one thing. She let the silence last, not as strategy, but as grace, because he needed time to reassemble himself, and she owed him that much at minimum. "How long?" he said, when he found his voice. "Since the night. A working I had been developing for months. We couldn't tell anyone. The fewer people holding the secret, the tighter the Fidelius held. You let me believe." A pause. "For 10 years. Yes. I made choices during that time. Choices I made because of the weight I was carrying, because of what I believed I owed, because of what I thought had happened." "I know," she said. "I have watched from the outside of it. You went to Dumbledore. You became his instrument. You did work that had to be done by someone willing to do it in the dark, with no acknowledgement. That's not nothing, Severus. And you said nothing. I couldn't find a way to do it safely. That is not an excuse. It is the reason." The fire in the grate moved. Outside the dungeon windows, the lake was flat gray, the light coming through the water at an angle that made the room feel like the bottom of something. "He looks like James," Snape said finally. "He has James's cheekbones," Lily said. "He has my eyes. He has his own everything else which is substantial, and which you would know if you had looked at him directly in the last 2 months, instead of taking points for the angle of his handwriting." A pause. Hermione documented it. "I know. Was she right about the deduction?" Something moved through his expression. Not quite amusement, but the territory adjacent to it. She corrected a footnote in my published potions monograph, through the library copy. "I know. Was she right?" Another pause. Longer. Technically. James appeared in the doorway. He had been looking for Lily and had followed his 20-year model of where she went when moving with purpose. He had not anticipated this destination. He stopped. He saw Snape. Snape saw him. The history between them occupied the room the way old weight occupies a structure. Not loudly, but load-bearingly. James walked in. He stood beside Lily. He waited. "My son is in your potions class," Lily said to Snape, "and you have been punishing him for looking like his father, which is something he did not choose and cannot change. I need to know whether you can separate that." "I find that Snape stopped, restarted. "The boy is not James Potter." "No," Lily said. "He is not. Look at him, Severus. Really look." Lily proposed the magic-bonded truce, a formal ceasefire instrument from the Potter grimoire, older than the Ministry, requiring both parties to agree without coercion. It did not enforce warmth. It did not require forgiveness. It prevented the use of magic against each other, and created formal space in which things could be different. James extended his hand first. No preamble. "For their sake," James said, "everything else can be a problem for later." Snap looked at the hand. He looked at Lily, who waited with the expression she had always used when waiting for him to be the version of himself he was capable of being, not demanding it, simply expecting it. He looked at the hand again. He shook it. The charm took with the sensation of a door closing quietly in a room you have been in so long you stopped noticing the draft. 3 days later, Harry's first individual potions session with Snape ran 40 minutes past its scheduled time. They spent most of the overtime on counter-agent substrate theory, on a footnote in Snape's published monograph that Harry had identified as possibly representing original unpublished research, and had wanted to ask about since September. When Harry came out, Hermione was in the corridor with a book she had not been reading. "How bad?" she said. "We spent 40 minutes on counter-agent substrate," Harry said. "He knows things that aren't in any published source. He has been working on something for years. Something adjacent to the soul fragment problem." Hermione straightened. "Should we tell Lily?" "I think Lily already knows," Harry said. "I think that is part of why she went to his classroom." They walked back toward the main staircase. Behind them, in the potions office, Snape sat at his desk with a student's question still active in his mind. A question about work he had done privately for 6 years and had not discussed with anyone. Asked by a boy with James Potter's face, and a line of inquiry that was either extraordinary intuition or extraordinary preparation. He picked up his quill and began to write. Not the supply requisitions which had sat untouched since Tuesday morning, but notes toward a problem he had been circling for years. Notes that had, until 40 minutes ago, been missing a specific framing. He wrote, "Until the fire burned low," and did not notice when it did. Harry went down to the chamber in mid-January, with James's approval, and James standing at the entrance. He slid down the pipe and waited for his eyes to adjust. The chamber was vast, columns carved as serpents, green filtered light giving everything the quality of being very deep underwater. He had been here twice before in preparation runs with the entrance open and Sirius monitoring from above. He knew the space. He let himself know it rather than trying to know it, which was the distinction Remus had spent 2 years trying to install in him. He felt her before he saw her, a presence at the far end, ancient, awake, and already aware of him. Not hostile. Something more considered than hostility which had already moved past that category of interest. The basilisk moved, and the moving of something that large was a sound rather than a sight. Stone and scale and the weight of several centuries adjusting its position. Her eyes were closed. What Harry understood, from the grimoire's older sections and from what the Sorting Hat's Slytherin imprint had told him during those 11 seconds at the sorting, was this. Salazar Slytherin had not built the chamber as a weapon. He had built it as a repository for the school's memory, a guardian who would hold the knowledge of what Hogwarts had been before the founders fell into irreconcilable disagreement. The basilisk had never been meant to kill. She had been meant to protect. The boy in the 1940s had arrived with the commanding register, and she had been unable to refuse it, and she had done things under that compulsion that she had spent 50 years reckoning with in the dark. Harry stood at the chamber's midpoint and spoke in the diplomatic register from the grimoire, the old protocol that addressed serpents as participants rather than instruments. "I come not as your master," he said. "I come as the heir of this school. I wish to hear your counsel." The basilisk went still in a different way. "You speak the protocol correctly," she said. Her voice was low and resonant, carrying the weight of something that had not spoken in a very long time. "The last heir who came here used the protocol as a key. You are using it as a door." "There is a difference," Harry said. "Yes," she said, "there is." The covenant was agreed in the old form, spoken, witnessed by the chamber's stone, binding in the way agreements between magical creatures and wizarding houses had been binding before the ministry existed. She would serve as guardian rather than weapon. The chamber would become what it had been built to be. Hermione descended 40 minutes later with her notebook already open. She had 17 questions organized by category. The basilisk regarded this second arrival with focused attention. "The small one," she said to Harry, "asks as if the answer matters beyond herself." "It does," Harry said. "Then I will answer." The great head tilted. "Tell her I remember the one who built this place. Tell her I remember when all four of them were still speaking to each other." Harry translated. Hermione's pen stopped moving. She looked up from her notebook. She looked at this creature that had been present since before Hogwarts became the institution it had grown into, that had watched its construction and its 8 centuries from beneath its foundations, that had carried the memory of the founders as living people rather than carved stone and legend. She wrote 4 words at the top of a fresh page. Primary source, Pre-Schism Hogwarts. Then she looked at Harry. "I am going to need more pages," she said. "I know." He produced the additional notebook he had carried in his robe pocket, which she took without comment, because they had been doing this long enough that the logistics of each other's work were simply part of the operational structure of the day. When Lucius Malfoy arrived in February, demanding answers about missing personal property from a student's belongings, James was in the entrance hall. "The object you placed in a student's belongings has been identified as a Class A dark object, contained, and unmade," James said. "You may speak with Lord Black about the formal charges being prepared under the Dark Artifacts Statute, or you may leave this building now and not return. You cannot simply—" "The board vote is 9-5 in our favor," Sirius said. "Your seat was suspended pending the Wizengamot review. You are not a governor at present. Technically, you are trespassing." Lucius found no angle from which his position improved. "And Lucius," James said, with the measured tone of a man who has been waiting years for a specific sentence, "the basilisk sends her regards." Lucius did not know what this meant. He did not know the condition of the basilisk or what her regards implied for his immediate circumstances. The not knowing was worse than any specific threat would have been, because specific threats have specific counters, and uncertainty has none. He left. He did not come back for a very long time. In the chamber below, Hermione was on question 11, and the basilisk was describing the original ward structure of the school's foundations in a level of detail that had not existed in any written source for 800 years. Hermione's handwriting had gotten smaller to fit more on each page. She did not notice until she returned to the dormitory and had to use a magnification charm to read her own notes. "Documentation methodology problem," she told Harry. "When's the next session?" "Thursday," she said, already writing the agenda. James Potter took his Wizengamot seat in the spring of Harry's second year at Hogwarts. He arrived with Sirius, 2 ancient houses, both occupied, both arriving with the bearing of people who had decided a decade ago exactly what they intended to do when this moment came. The chamber had the atmosphere of an institution that had survived by moving carefully for 9 centuries. Dark paneling, tiered seating in a horseshoe, the Wizengamot seal in enchanted stone. 50 seats, occupied by people who had spent varying portions of the past decade doing varying amounts of nothing about the various things that had required doing. Lucius Malfoy, in his seat 3 rows from the front, cycled through 3 expressions in under 2 seconds and arrived at composed. His composure had been working very hard lately. James waited until the procedural opening was complete. "I file a petition of prior conduct," he said, his voice carried without requiring volume. "Under the Wizengamot's founding charter, this petition demands formal investigation into any member of this chamber or officer of the ministry who served Voldemort during the First Wizarding War and escaped consequence through claimed coercion or political arrangement." He set the petition on the record table, 43 pages, indexed, cross-referenced, tabbed. "I additionally invoke the Founder's voice, an obscure provision of the Wizengamot's pre-ministry founding compact, confirmed in writing by this chamber's own legal office 3 weeks ago in response to a formal inquiry I submitted in advance, to prevent procedural challenge to this petition pending its assignment to an investigative panel." The chamber went to the particular quiet of 50 people thinking fast, in the same room. The provision had not been invoked in 3 centuries. The Marauders had found it buried in the founding compact through Lily's research. so old and so thoroughly forgotten that no subsequent procedural rule had thought to address it. And the Wizengamot's own legal office had confirmed its technical validity with the careful phrasing of people who had opened an archive they had never previously needed and found it in unexpectedly good order. The petition was assigned to an investigative panel before the session ended. The evidence against Lucius Malfoy was a decade of systematic collection. 3 Veritaserum verified statements from former Death Eaters who had accepted Marauder Regency pardons in exchange for documented accounts filed with the Gringotts notarial service rather than the ministry, because Lily had identified the ministry's notarial process as potentially compromised years earlier and had built around it. Financial records from a Gringotts audit, Sirius's personal testimony, delivered with the flat precision of someone who had been saving this specific account for a specific moment and had arrived at it. The Imperious defense had been well constructed and had worked in the immediate post-war period when the ministry was too damaged and too grateful to examine it rigorously. The panel examined it rigorously. The financial records were the critical element. A man under the Imperious curse does not make targeted donations to political causes. He does not draft correspondence to ministry officials that anticipates, by weeks in several cases, developments in Voldemort's strategic priorities that were not yet publicly known. He does not purchase, through third-party proxies, 3 Wizengamot seats whose holders then vote in consistent alignment with Death Eater-adjacent policy positions, because Imperious removes the capacity for strategic initiative, and those purchases required strategic initiative applied with considerable intelligence across years. Lucius's defense fell apart by degrees, not dramatically, but systematically, the way a structure fails when load-bearing elements are removed in sequence. His legal team filed 4 objections. 2 were sustained. 2 were overruled, and the overrulings went to the record with full reasoning, becoming precedent. The panel deliberated for 2 hours. Lucius Malfoy was stripped of his Wizengamot seat. He lost every appointed position. Ministry Aurors escorted him from the chamber with the courtesy reserved for people who still had enough social standing to make discourtesy inconvenient. He passed James on the way out. "This isn't over," Lucius said. James looked at him with the patience of someone who has run this calculation many times and arrived at the same sum. "Lucius, you have no Wizengamot seat, no institutional power, no board position, and no Voldemort. What exactly do you imagine you're going to do?" No answer came. Dolores Umbridge's removal was quieter, and in the way of things that are quiet because they are complete, more satisfying. Peter had spent the summer building the case from the public record, and from things people had said in rooms where they had forgotten he was present. He was always present. This had always been the point. What he documented was irregular financial conduct. Umbridge held silent financial interests in 3 pure-blood supply companies that benefited directly from discriminatory licensing regulations she had drafted and pushed through years earlier. The documentation was detailed, and the financial trail was clear. The disclosure was filed simultaneously with the Wizengamot session, timed by Lily to ensure the ministry's attention was divided between 2 crises rather than concentrated on one. Umbridge received notification at 4 o'clock. Within 48 hours, she had elected to transfer to a ministry position without external oversight authority. She left without ceremony. Theodore Knott sent his carefully worded letter to Peter Pettigrew at Potter Manor that Monday. He said only, "I believe we have common interests. I am willing to be more useful than I have been." Peter's reply arrived at the end of the week. "I know. I have been waiting for you to figure it out." In the Marauder debrief at Potter Manor that weekend, Peter sat at the kitchen table and turned his glass on the surface. The financial trail, the proxy purchases. He said, "I was in 3 of those rooms when Lucius arranged them. Not as anyone important, as nobody, essentially. The man who refills the water glasses." "I know," James said. "He never thought about me being there." "No," James said. "He didn't." Peter was quiet for a moment. "I've been in the right rooms for 20 years, thinking it was the consolation prize, for not being—" He stopped, started again with different words. "And then I sit here and look at this table and think, that was the whole thing. That was the part that worked." Nobody spoke for a moment. "It was always the part that was going to work," Lily said. "We knew that from the beginning." "You knew," Peter said. "James told me. I didn't believe it for a long time." "I know," James said. "You do now." Peter looked at the map on the kitchen wall, the footprints of 5 adults and 2 children who were at Hogwarts and would be home next weekend. whose names were written in the handwriting of 4 young men who had made the map when they were young and had not yet understood what it was for. "Ask me again in 10 years," James had said in a flat in Bethnal Green in the second year of a war, and Peter had asked, and the answer was this: the kitchen and the fire and the map and the work that had worked. "Right," he said. "What's next?" The Triwizard Tournament was announced in their 4th year, and Lily had been ready for it since the previous summer. Snape's letter arrived 4 weeks before the Beauxbatons carriage and the Durmstrang ship were due at Hogwarts. 3 sentences, the third being the one that mattered. The mechanism they are building requires a named champion. The goblet cannot be deceived by an age line. It can, however, be preempted by prior submission under older law. Lily found a relevant provision in the Triwizard Founding Compact in 9 minutes, a document in the Potter collection she had flagged years earlier without yet knowing exactly why. The sovereign heir submission. An ancient house sovereign could name their heir directly as champion, bypassing the standard selection process, under a provision written into the original compact at the insistence of ancient houses who had refused to participate in any competitive magical framework that didn't recognize hereditary representation rights. The provision had not been used in centuries. It had not been repealed because it existed in the Founding Compact rather than the tournament rule set, and the Founding Compact was not subject to revision by any committee formed after it. The Goblet of Fire was bound to magical law rather than ministry policy. It predated the ministry by 2 centuries. It would recognize the provision because it had no architecture for refusing it. Lily wrote 2 submission letters before dinner. She sealed them and sent them to the Goblet's custodian at the Department of Magical Games and Sports by Ministry Owl, where they would be logged, dated, and legally binding before anyone at Hogwarts knew they existed. Then she wrote back to Snape, "Thank you. Already handled. Watch whoever is playing Moody. The magical signature is inconsistent with the registered profile." Snape's reply came by return owl, 3 words: "I already am." The goblet sat in the entrance hall for 3 days. Students circled it with varying degrees of ambition and caution. Fred and George Weasley's attempt, an aging potion, a running start, and a spectacular simultaneous ejection from the age line producing 2 bearded identical boys, was, Harry told Hermione, the most technically entertaining failure he had witnessed since the duelist and the boulder in year 3 of their training. Hermione agreed, made a note about the age line's detection mechanism, and returned to the essay she was writing on the compact's historical precedents. She had not told Harry about the submission until the 2nd week of October, when she judged he had processed the tournament's revival sufficiently to receive the additional information without conflating it with excitement. "Our names are already in," Harry said. "Since the start of term," Hermione said, "filed with the custodian under the sovereign heir submission provision. The goblet will accept both. The provision predates the 1 champion per school rule by centuries. When 2 individuals are submitted under the same ancient house heir designation, and the goblet identifies them as a combined tactical unit, which it will because of a decade of shared training, it has no mechanism for selecting only one." Harry looked at her. "Mum has been planning this since summer. She found the provision years ago," Hermione said. "She has been waiting for the tournament to come back. The selection happened on Halloween evening. Cedric Diggory's name came first. Red parchment, the Hufflepuff table producing the sustained noise of genuine pride." Fleur Delacour walked forward from the Beauxbatons delegation with the composure of someone who expected this. Victor Crumb's name produced the sound of a crowd that respected demonstrated excellence, without needing to manufacture enthusiasm. Then the goblet went still. The pause had the quality of a known rhythm reaching its expected conclusion. Then the goblet flared, the flame changing from the cool blue-white of standard selection to something deeper and older-looking, gold with the quality of a different kind of age. 2 slips of parchment emerged simultaneously, burning at their edges as they fell into Dumbledore's hands. Dumbledore read the first. The second, the calculation in his expression during this interval, was the most carefully managed visible thinking Harry had ever watched him perform. "Harry James Potter," he said, "and Hermione Jean Granger, sovereign heirs of the ancient and noble house of Potter." The hall came apart. The challenge from the other school's headmasters took 11 minutes and failed. Lily presented the founding compact, the provision, the dated submission letters, and a legal summary their solicitor had prepared against precisely this contingency. The tournament's own rulebook contained no clause superseding the founding compact. Karkaroff looked at the compact for a long time. "The selection stands," he said. It was not gracious. It was accurate. Dumbledore said very quietly, "Of course." The first task was dragons. Harry flew at his level, on a broom. He existed in a different category than other people on brooms. The Hungarian Horntail tracked him because he was the moving thing, and the moving thing was what the dragon's attention was built for. While the dragon watched Harry, Hermione was at the enclosure's eastern edge. She had spent 3 weeks studying Horntail behavioral patterns and identified a consistent blind spot in the creature's peripheral vision at the lower left. From that angle, moving in the register Sirius had taught her for environmental penetration, she approached the nest, retrieved the golden egg, and was back at the champion's waiting area before Harry completed his third pass over the arena. They finished in under 4 minutes. The judges had no rubric for this. They conferred for 12 minutes and awarded full marks. Victor Crumb watched Hermione close her notebook with an expression of updated professional assessment. "They divided the task," he said to Cedric. "They have been doing that their whole lives," Cedric said. "I think that is just how they think." The second task produced a signed diplomatic agreement with the merfolk. James had been in correspondence with the merchieftain of the Hogwarts Lake for 2 years. Through a water-sealed message system Remus had developed, on the principle that relationships built before a crisis were the only kind useful during one. Harry spoke to the merchieftain in the creature language register Remus had taught. Hermione drafted the outline of a renewed governance agreement in the margins of her waterproofed notebook. They surfaced 47 minutes later with a signed protocol and the other champions' hostages, whom they had retrieved on the return crossing because leaving them would have been unnecessarily pointed. The third task fell in 40 minutes. The maze had been designed to test individual navigation and defense against standard advanced enchantments. Harry and Hermione moved through it as a unit. Harry's environmental transfiguration clearing physical obstacles, Hermione's ward dissolution working through the enchanted barriers at a speed the maze's responsive magic couldn't match. They used no verbal communication. The 47 body signals they had developed at 9 were faster than speech and more precise. When they reached the Triwizard Cup, Harry stopped. He held his hand 6 inches from the handle and felt what Lily had spent 2 summers teaching him to read, the tug of a prepared spatial displacement, a portkey destination pull. He held it for 3 seconds. Below the standard pull was something colder, not a destination, a trap anchor. "Someone prepared this location in advance," Hermione said, the diagnostic chain running from her left hand. "The secondary signature is not a destination. It is a kill site, a place where violent death has been performed repeatedly, with intent." Harry stepped back from the cup. He looked at it sitting on the grass, designed by someone who believed he would touch it without checking. "Patronus," he said. She cast immediately. The silver otter burst from her wand and was through the maze wall toward the spectators' enclosure before Harry finished the word. "How long before someone comes to check why we have not arrived?" "Approximately 4 minutes if they are monitoring the anchor activation. Then we wait and make sure they come to us." 3 minutes and 40 seconds later, the person running the tournament's shadow operation arrived, moving fast, the gait of someone whose mechanism has not activated on schedule and who is calculating what that means. He came around the final corner and found Harry and Hermione standing 20 feet from the cup, looking at him. The man wearing Mad-Eye Moody's face stopped. "Mr. Crouch," Harry said pleasantly, "we thought it might be you. The magical signature on the portkey is structurally similar to the ward pattern in your office. Peter noticed it in October." Bartemius Crouch Jr. looked at 2 14-year-olds in a maze at midnight with the ease of people who had been expecting this moment, and reached the rapid calculation of a man who has just understood that his plan has already ended. He reached for his wand. James came through the maze wall from the north, Sirius through the eastern wall. Peter had sealed the exit 20 minutes earlier from outside. Lily had sent the aurora notification from the spectators' enclosure before Harry's Patronus arrived. Crouch was surrounded before his wand cleared his pocket. He was delivered to Aurors, who had been waiting at the maze entrance since Lily's signal. He gave a full confession under Veritaserum on Monday morning, recorded, witnessed by 3 independent observers, and filed in a format that could not be lost or quietly shelved. The graveyard ritual would not proceed. Voldemort remained in his diminished state. A plan built across a year had been identified, documented, and dismantled before it reached its activation point. The false peace offer arrived the following February. through a ministry official within Fudge's circle who had been feeding disinformation in both directions for 18 months. A neutral meeting, no wands, a negotiated settlement. Voldemort would abandon his pursuit of full embodiment in exchange for the permanent withdrawal of the Marauder household from political and magical life. Lily read it first. She left it on the kitchen table without comment, because she had already run the calculation. They all arrived at the same place independently. James, it's a trap. Sirius, obviously. Remus, it's also information. The subtext is more useful than the offer. Peter, he is trying not to lose. That is different from trying to win. A person trying not to lose makes a different category of mistake. Lily, he is also buying time. He bound Nagini as a Horcrux during the year he spent possessing Quirrell, used his time in that hosting state to perform the creation ritual. Peter's source confirmed the event. His return path stays open as long as she lives. Hermione, from the doorway. The response to an offer you cannot accept should be a counteroffer he cannot accept, designed to reveal his operational timeline. If he moves, we learn when. If he does not, we learn what he is waiting for. The counteroffer was composed by Lily and Hermione over 2 hours. It accepted the meeting in principle, but required it to occur on neutral ground that would necessitate Voldemort's forces committing to a specific position, 48 hours in advance. Voldemort spent 3 days calculating whether this was a trap. Then he mobilized. Because 40 years of believing that his power was the decisive variable in any confrontation had produced in the end a man who could not choose inaction when action was available. He moved on Little Hangleton, his own terrain, the place where he had planned, in a version of events that had not come to pass, to restore himself fully. The Marauder Legion was already there. The ward structure on Little Hangleton had been under construction since autumn. Lily had designed it on a principle developed during the underground years. The most effective containment does not prevent entry, it prevents exit. Let them come in easily. Let the ease feel like advantage. Let them commit their forces before the walls go up. The walls went up at 2 a.m. No visible light, no sound, nothing that registered as a new structure to magical detection. The ward activated by keying to the ambient magical field and shifting it slowly, the way weather shifts, too gradual to identify as a discrete event until the completeness was everywhere at once. James and Sirius took the mobile positions, moving with the pack-cast resonance that 14 years of practice had made instinctive. 2 frequencies in alignment, extending range and penetration beyond what either could achieve alone. Remus managed creature coordination from the northern perimeter. Sybil, the basilisk, who had agreed to her role after 3 careful conversations, because Harry had needed to discuss it 3 times before he was at peace with asking it of her, moved through the village's deep foundations beneath the stone. Peter was nowhere visible. This was where Peter was most useful. Lily held the ward boundary from the village church at the eastern edge, the structural anchor point, and felt everything the ward felt. Harry and Hermione were at the center. Voldemort arrived before dawn, with 31 Death Eaters and the confidence of a man who had spent 40 years being the most dangerous thing in any room he entered. His forces began apparating in standard spread formation. The first 6 arrived without incident. The 7th tried to leave and found the boundary. Not a wall, not a barrier that announced itself, the sensation of a ward that had been around you long enough to have become the shape of the air. By the time Voldemort himself arrived, the perimeter calculation had shifted. Not panic, but the recalculation of people who have understood that the geometry of the situation is not what they believed. Voldemort stood in the center of Little Hangleton and felt the ward's structure and recognized its quality. The work of someone who had spent years solving exactly this problem. He recognized Lily Potter's architecture because he had spent a decade looking for what had defeated him at the manor's boundary and had never found it. He was encountering it now, surrounding him on every side. The battle began because it had to. 31 Death Eaters, surrounded by a ward they couldn't breach, and facing opposition they couldn't clearly identify, defaulted to the training they had, which was attack. The curses came out in coordinated patterns, and James and Sirius moved through them with the pack-cast running at full load, reshaping the field rather than responding to it. Remus took a curse to the left arm in the 2nd minute. He noted it, adjusted his position, and continued. Acknowledge, compensate, continue. Deal with it after. Harry and Hermione moved toward the center, using the environmental penetration approach. Not hidden, simply moving in a register that the chaos around them wasn't configured to process until they were already past it. Voldemort saw Harry when he was 15 feet away. "I expected more of a performance," Harry said. "You expected to die," Voldemort said. "You sent a peace offer," Harry said. "You had intelligence on us. You knew what we were, and you sent a peace offer instead of coming here immediately. That is not a decision made from strength. That is a man who ran a calculation and did not like the answer." "I am Lord Voldemort. You have been afraid of our household for 14 years, Harry said. "We grew up in it. The duel that followed was the full Marauder curriculum applied against the most dangerous wizard alive." Harry used partial animagus transformation, at 30% for lateral positioning, covering distances in ways Voldemort's reflexes weren't calibrated for, because no opponent in 40 years had moved that way. He used combat transfiguration in the James tradition, transforming the environment rather than projecting through it: the ground, the air, the walls, every surface and instrument. Shadow walking for angles that should not have been geometrically available. Voldemort adapted rapidly, and Harry registered this with the part of his attention Remus had trained to observe, even under pressure, because understanding what you fought was always worth more than the energy of failing to understand it. Hermione was not fighting Voldemort. Hermione was solving the Horcrux. She had been working the substrate protocol since summer, building on Snape's compound in her own rune sequence, extended for non-cooperative application. A soul fragment in a living host without the option of willing stillness. The modification had taken 3 months. She executed it now with the focused precision of someone running a procedure rehearsed 40 times. She found the scar fragment first. Harry felt it the way he had always felt it, the wrong note presence at the edge of his own magic, the cold of something that was not him but had been in him long enough to feel like weather. Then the protocol engaged and the cold moved. And it was not painful in the way that pain is pain, but it was the opposite of comfortable, something being separated from something else that had grown around it. The cold was gone in 11 seconds. For the first time since he was 5 years old, Harry Potter was only himself. He felt the absence as warmth, not the arrival of something new, but the departure of something wrong, a space that had been occupied by the wrong thing for a decade, and was now simply space. His casting changed. Voldemort felt the quality of the magic coming at him change in a way he couldn't immediately categorize, and the inability to categorize it was its own kind of pressure. Hermione turned to Nagini. Sybil was already moving from below. Harry gave the signal in Parseltongue. 2 words in the diplomatic register, too quiet for anyone but the serpent to hear. Sybil came up through the village's eastern foundation in the spot Harry had identified with her 3 weeks prior, where the stone was oldest and thinnest, and she moved with the economy of a creature that had agreed to do a thing and was doing it without ceremony. Nagini had time to turn. She did not have time to do anything else. Voldemort felt each loss arrive, had felt them arriving across years as missing frequencies. The ring, long gone, the diary, each subsequent, one registering more clearly as his own magical architecture, grew more coherent, and the losses became legible for what they were. Nagini was the last external anchor. When she went, the full accounting came. 7 gone, and the binding that had held his fragmented soul in this body, always precarious, always requiring effort to maintain, simply gave out. He was mortal in the way he had always feared, and he was depleted past the point of action. The ward's sustained pressure, the battle's drain, the cascading loss of every anchor, it had left him with nothing to spend. He could not raise his wand. It was not a decision, it was a physical fact. He was surrounded on every side, disarmed by his own exhaustion. Harry stopped moving. Voldemort stopped moving. They stood 10 feet apart in the square, the battle quiet around them, the Aurors coming through the boundary point Lily had left open at the eastern edge. "Put down the wand," Harry said. "You won't kill me," Voldemort said. "No," Harry said, "but you will die anyway. It is just a question of when and how much of what is left of you gets spent between now and then." Tom Riddle looked at Harry Potter for a very long moment. Perhaps he saw the boy he had shaped through accident, the child marked by his own failed curse, made into something his planning had not accounted for. His planning had not accounted for the possibility that the boy would be loved well and trained well and would arrive at this moment having chosen it. The Aurors took him. He was tried. He was imprisoned in a body aging at a pace that magic had previously held back and now could not, with no anchor and no return. Sirius found Lucius Malfoy in an alley off the northern approach, hooded, watching from the dark with the posture of someone who had come to witness a victory and had spent 40 minutes revising that expectation. The dark mark was visible on his forearm where the sleeve had shifted. Sirius removed the hood. "You came to watch," Sirius said. Lucius said nothing. "You told the Wizengamot you were under the Imperius when you accepted the mark. You had tears in your eyes." Sirius looked at him steadily. "You are in an alley at a Death Eater battle with your mark visible. Explain that," he signaled the Aurors. Harry and Hermione stood in the village square while the Aurors worked around them. Harry pressed his palm briefly to his forehead. The scar was there, silver white settled into his face the way permanent things settle. Simply a mark, simply his. But the cold that had lived beneath it since he was 5 years old was gone. "Is it done?" Hermione said. "It is done," Harry said. She was quiet for a moment, not writing, which was unusual enough that he noticed. "The modification to the non-cooperative extraction held through the full procedure," she said. 11 seconds. "I know. I was there. I want it on the record." "Write it down tomorrow," Harry said. "Tonight just be here." Hermione looked at the village, at the stone and the dark and the ordinary English night reasserting itself over what had happened in it. She put her notebook in her pocket. She stood beside Harry in the quiet. James arrived from the northern perimeter and put his hand on Harry's shoulder without speaking, the way James expressed things that were larger than words. Sirius came from the alley, Remus from the northern edge with his left arm wrapped, and his expression of someone who has reached the end of something and is taking a moment to confirm it is actually the end. Peter appeared from nowhere in the way he appeared from places, simply present, having been there for some time already without being visible, which had always been the whole point. 7 people in a village square in Yorkshire before dawn. The map, version 7, refined 3 times since Hogwarts began, would show all 7 footprints clustered together when they checked it later. 7 names in the handwriting of 4 young men who had made the map when they were young and had not yet understood what they were building it for. James looked at his son. "The door held," he said. Harry looked back at him. "The door held," he said. The Comprehensive Magical Education and Anti-Discrimination Act passed the Wizengamot in the autumn that followed, 31 votes to 9. James watched the hands go up without counting until it was over, because he had done enough counting in advance. Sirius sat in the black seat with his arms crossed, and his face doing the thing it did when he was receiving something he had worked toward for a very long time. Not triumph, which was too loud for the occasion, but a settling, the feeling of a structure becoming load-bearing at last. The act abolished the remaining employment restrictions on part humans. Remus at Hogwarts, when the news arrived, read the relevant clause 3 times with the expression of a man checking that the words mean what he thinks they mean. Then he put the letter down and looked out his office window at the grounds for a long time, and the groundskeeper passing below waved, and Remus waved back, and that was all. The act established a mandatory curriculum review for Hogwarts requiring subjects to be assessed for practical utility every 5 years. It created a Muggle-born support framework named to Lily's persistent and documented horror, the Lily Potter Integration Program, to provide early support for Muggle-born children and their families encountering the wizarding world for the first time. It formally stripped the Board of Governors of the ability to appoint ministry-aligned observers to the school, without full board ratification. Dolores Umbridge, reading the act from a mid-level ministry position with no meaningful leverage over its implementation, wrote a strongly worded internal memo. It was filed. The filing system sorted by relevance. The memo went to the bottom and stayed there. Theodore Knott joined the Wizengamot's Youth Advisory Program that same term, and was, within weeks, among its most effective members. The older participants noted privately that he reminded them of a young Sirius Black. It was a comparison that would have appalled him, and it was entirely accurate. Draco Malfoy was not the person he had been at 11. 5 years of proximity to people who pushed back, not loudly, not cruelly, but consistently, and without giving way, had done its work. He was not reformed in any dramatic sense. 17 was not finished. But the specific certainties his childhood had given him had developed cracks, and through the cracks, something was entering that had not been there before. He would spend a considerable amount of time figuring out what to do with it. This was, as it turned out, the most important work he had done so far. Hogwarts in the years that followed was different in the way institutions change, when what was constraining them has been removed. Not all at once, but in the way a room changes when a wall turns out not to have been load-bearing after all. 3 new courses were introduced: Advanced Creature Studies, Practical Political Magic, and Applied Magical Theory, the last Remus's, treating magic as a subject with consistent internal logic that could be derived rather than merely memorized. Students who took it in its first year would spend years afterward trying to describe what it had done to how they thought. They usually arrived at some version of, "It made the world make sense." Hermione sat in the front row and asked questions that required weeks to properly answer. Remus did not find this discouraging. He found it the best thing that had happened to him professionally in 40 years, which he told James on a Saturday at the Manor, and which James wrote in his journal that evening in the shorthand he used for things he wanted to have on record. Snape remained head of Slytherin. He remained exacting and difficult, and the kind of teacher who produced exceptional students through methods that would appear in no pedagogy handbook. McGonagall kept a private tally, on a small piece of parchment in her desk drawer, of the times he had given full marks to a Gryffindor. She updated it with the satisfaction of someone tracking a slow but genuine thing. Peter Pettigrew retired from active fieldwork and became, officially, Director of Intelligence Architecture for the Marauder Regency's formalized security consultancy. He taught 2 evenings a week at the Marauder Academy's introductory program, running the Espionage and Environmental Awareness module. His students were consistently surprised by him. This had always been the point. Sirius, told about the retirement, sat at the kitchen table and looked at Peter for a moment. "You've earned it," Sirius said. "I know," Peter said. "I'm not going to make a thing of this. I know that too." "Good." Sirius refilled both their glasses. "To the forgotten man, Peter said, and drank. At the summer solstice celebration at the Manor, which had happened every year since Hermione was 4, the Grangers arriving with the same punctual warmth they had always brought, Robert Granger found Helen in the courtyard before dinner. Hermione was in the courtyard with Harry, animated about something that involved both of them making diagrams in the air with their hands. The gold star on Hermione's wrist, the living ward she had carried since she was 3, was bright enough to see from a distance. It glowed when Hermione was genuinely happy. Robert had noticed it the first time it happened, years ago, and had never said anything. The expression on his daughter's face had always been sufficient. "She submitted the paper," Robert said, handing Helen a glass. "I know. She sent us the acceptance letter. International Journal of Ancient Magic," he said it quietly. "She will be 17 in September," Helen said. He watched Hermione make a point emphatically, and Harry make a counterpoint, and Hermione immediately began revising the diagram. Not toward a winner, toward a better diagram. This was how their arguments had always gone. "Still," Robert said. "Still," Helen agreed. The Marauders map was formally donated to Hogwarts. As a permanent institutional tool in the autumn of the year, Harry and Hermione completed their NEWTs. McGonagall accepted it at a small ceremony in the entrance hall with the expression she used for things she found genuinely significant and intended to receive without performance. The map's case was engraved James Potter, Sirius Black, Remus Lupin, Peter Pettigrew, Lily Potter, Hermione Granger, Harry Potter. 7 names. The map inside showed every footprint in the castle in real time, updated continuously with the 3 additional layers Hermione had built across 5 years at Hogwarts: the mass and gate secondary tracking, the sympathetic alert mirror set, the mood resonance color system that made the map not merely an intelligence tool, but a living record of the school's well-being. It was the most sophisticated intelligence instrument in the British wizarding world, and it now belonged to the school. McGonagall looked at the case for a long moment. Then she looked at James, standing slightly apart from the group, with his hands in his pockets and the expression he wore when something was complete. "You built it at 16, she said. "We built it at 16, James said. "They finished it." McGonagall looked at Harry and Hermione. She had been a teacher for 38 years. She had watched James Potter become who he became from exactly this starting point, in this building, and had thought at the time that she understood what she was watching. She understood now that she had seen the raw material and had not foreseen the finished thing, which was standing in her entrance hall with its name beside 6 others. Having just handed her the most important institutional gift the school had received in living memory, she had been a teacher long enough to know that this was the whole point, that the thing you built in them would do something you couldn't have anticipated, and that not having anticipated it was not a failure of imagination, but the correct result of teaching someone well. "Thank you," she said. "Both of you." "Both of us and 5 others," Hermione said, with the precision she brought to everything. 7, McGonagall said. "Yes." The astronomy tower on the last night of term. Late, the castle breathing around them. Harry and Hermione had come here since their first year, not as a tradition they decided to create, but because it had become the place they came when the castle was quiet, and there was space to think. The habit established itself before either of them noticed it was a habit. Below them, Hogwarts continued, more itself than it had been in decades, more open about what it was. Light moved through the windows in the patterns of a building that was finally being used as it was meant to be used. The enchanted ceiling in the great hall shifted between stars and gathering cloud. Somewhere in the forbidden forest, Sybil was awake in the summer dark, occasionally sending Harry brief communications in the old register that amounted to, "The grounds are well. The southern perimeter is peaceful." Something small and curious passed through at dusk, but it meant no harm. Harry forwarded these to Hagrid, who found this arrangement entirely natural, and had, in fact, been hoping for it. Hermione had a book open on her knee that she was not reading. "Do you ever think about what it would have been like," she said, "if everything had gone the other way?" Harry thought, "Sometimes. A cupboard under some stairs. A letter from an owl I had never seen. A girl on a train trying to memorize everything she had not had years to learn." "We would have been okay," Harry said. Hermione considered it carefully, the way she considered things that were important enough to get right. "We would have been resilient," she said. "That is not quite the same thing." "No," Harry agreed. "It's not." The stars moved in their slow way. Below them, the castle continued. In the Highland night, in a manner that had kept its secrets and its promises for 15 years, 5 adults were asleep, the fire burning low in the kitchen, the map on the study wall showing the quiet footprints of an empty house, the ward structure doing what it had always done, without being asked. Harry looked at the scar on his forehead without touching it, silver white now, settled into his face the way all permanent things settle, simply a mark, simply his. "Think we did it?" he said. Hermione did not answer immediately. He had long since learned to wait in this particular silence, the silence of someone running the full calculation rather than the nearest available one. "Ask me again in 20 years, she said. "I will have better data," Harry laughed. It carried out into the summer air and down into the grounds, and the castle received it the way old buildings receive the sounds of people who belong in them, completely without remainder, as though the stone had been waiting for exactly this frequency and recognized it when it came. Below, Hogwarts listened. The stars moved. The map showed 7 footprints all where they should be. "Let us know what you'd like to see next." The end.